Why do we call it the motherland when it isn't where our mothers are? You're listening to my audiobook review. I'm Jacob Shamansky. Today we're reviewing Reuniting with Strangers by Jennilee Austria-Bonifacio, which was recommended to us by Aamer Khan, our very own audiobook curator. Aamer Khan and AMI's Ramya Amuthan are here for that review. First of all, Aamer, thanks so much for the recommendation. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much. Always a pleasure to be here.
And Rams, I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts on this one because you've kind of established yourself as the tough critic in this group when we review things. It always turns out that way. And I do have some hints. I got some hints from you already.
Yeah,
But,
full
you have mixed
disclosure.
feelings.
I started reviewing the book before even realizing you didn't even start reading it, so my bad about that. Oops.
Yeah, you kind of planted some negative
I know.
feelings,
I came in
vibes
hot.
into me heading into it.
Sorry.
So I had to erase that from my mind to give this a fair review. And the short version of my thoughts on this one is that pretty decent. Honestly, I liked it quite a bit. So you didn't ruin it for me, so don't worry about that. But
Good.
Aamer, let's start with you since you're the one that recommended it. Why did you pick this one?
So I picked it because it's a very well put together book. I actually met the author as well at an event for the Toronto Book Awards.
Oh, cool.
So it seemed like an interesting concept. And this is one of the rare books where I would encourage people to take a look at the table of contents and the chapters before actually reading it, because you get a sense of this book is not like sort of one continuous piece. It's actually broken into chapter by chapter and it's sort of manufactured and structured that way. In terms of different perspectives in each chapter, there is a thread that sort of goes through all of it, but they are very different perspectives chapter to chapter. So my sort of overarching sort of review of this is that it's a well put together book. It is pretty tough to get through the first half, I would say. It's not sort of a very joyous book to begin with. It deals with a lot of tough topics without making you cry too much. But the book gets better as you go. But there is a point, I would say, about halfway where you really start to understand where the author is coming from and putting things together so that, you're not just feeling like this book is beating up on Canada or about leaving your homeland.
Why do you recommend that we read the table of contents beforehand? Because I deliberately skipped over that.
Me
I
too.
typically do too. I actually just glanced at it before we started here just to take a look at the different chapters, just to remind myself of the different perspectives. And I think that would be a really good thing for people to do before they get into it, because this book doesn't have a whole lot of spoilers. And I don't think you're going to get a whole lot of spoilers from reading the chapter pieces. I think it's a very good primer to get into this book, especially if you have no expectations going into it. You're going to be sort of lost as to each chapter sort of jumping around.
Yeah, that's fair.
Aamer, you provided us a sort of alternative synopsis because the one that's publicly available for this book is bad. So I appreciate you sending us this one. I'm just going to read it really quickly because just to make sure we're all on the same page here.
Sure.
Imagine yourself living in a poor fishing village where every other person is going abroad and sending money back to take care of their family. Stories of a whole modern world outside yours beckons as your prospects as home are non-existent. So you apply to go abroad and find yourself unexpectedly caring for another family's children in order to send money to yours. The book has many different perspectives, but the first story winds its way through most of the book and holds it together as the author tackles multiple subjects such as racism, cultural responsibility, family obligation, sacrifice, and the Canadian immigrant experience. Although the book is short, I call this a chapter book, which means it's best to take this book one chapter at a time rather than binge it, as most of the chapters give you a lot to think about. Shortlisted for the Toronto Book Awards 2024. Aamer, I just realized you wrote this in first person, so I feel like I took the words right out of your mouth. Do you testify that these are your thoughts?
Yes. I agree with everything that person said.
Well written.
And I'm very curious to know if Ramya actually binged it.
I was going to say it's very hard not to binge this book because it's under 7 hours and I definitely listen to it at like 1.1, 1.2 speed. So it's hard not to binge this book. Absolutely, I binged it. I did read it in 3 separate time frames though, so I did have a lot of just digestion period between those chunks. But yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Also know that it's available on Sela in human narrated audio, and like Rams mentions, just a little over 7 hours. So it is bingeable, even though Aamer doesn't recommend that you do
No.
that.
And multiple
Fortunately,
narrators, multiple
multiple
storylines.
narratives. Yeah, that's true. It's a fairly dense book in a lot of ways. But if there's one thing I would add to that synopsis, just to make sure people know what they're getting themselves into, it's kind of like a loosely connected net of short stories.
Mm-hmm.
Or at least that's how I interpreted it without having read
Yeah,
like
I'd
a
say that's
synopsis
accurate.
going
Yeah,
into it.
that's
Yeah.
accurate.
And I would ask you, Amer, like generally, like what are your thoughts on this book? Like, do you think it deserves to be shortlisted for the Toronto Book Award 2024?
I think so. I mean, I've seen some of the other candidates, but I haven't read some of the other books. But like I said, it's a well-structured book. It's a very well-written book. I mean, the underlying other theme of this book is that it's about the Filipino-Canadian experience, right? I mean, if you don't know a lot about the Philippines, this is a great book to sort of introduce yourself to it. And, you know, the topic of not only being Filipino, but what it is to be Filipino in Canada and, you know, still have most of your family back home. I reviewed another book called Homes a while ago, which was about the Syrian Canadian experience. And this book is very different, I would say. I mean, the theme is similar, but it's a much more, you know, harsher look at Canadian life in relation to what life was back home. One of my personal favorite chapters is the one of Lolo Bayani, which is an older man whose children aren't, you know, none of them are there anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And he's in this sort of historic older house and living the old ways, and none of his children are around. And, you know, he's sort of lamenting on that fact. And you see this story sort of develop as the author sort of puts different pieces in front of you in terms of how he's going to live the last days of his life.
Every point of view in this book is from a Filipino Canadian caregiver or somebody who's directly related to a Filipino Canadian caregiver. So it's very laser focused on that specific community, but it also tells you a lot about just generally the Canadian immigrant story, like that, almost like the legend, like the urban legend, like surrounding that and everything that comes with immigration. Um, and there's certain things that I learned about immigration that I never really considered, and that's just how separated families can be during the immigration process and multi-generational conflicts happening, where there's just differences of where, like, because a kid grew up in Canada, they're naturally going to be completely different than their grandparents who spent their entire lives in the Philippines. It creates a lot of generational divide that's sometimes impossible to broach.
Every type
Yeah.
of divide, actually. I think this book touches, to put it bluntly, on a lot of everyday issues and challenges that, like, just personally, that and individually, that we would kind of colloquial say first world problems, because it shines a light on so many things, relationships, and dynamics in relationships specifically, but not just limited to that. It shines a light on how complicated and painful and distant people have gone on for years and years and years, just for the simple things as, you know, I need to go away so that I can work, so that my family can be provided for. And it takes that general concept and it gives you all the context around it in this book, right? In every kind of story that we hear, in every dynamic that we explore, in the relationships and the frustrations and the emotional ups and downs, then the hard work that people are putting in, but all that for what? Because, you know, it's the general belief that a better life is this way.
Yeah, and I think this book in specific tackles the emotional um, sort of challenges that you have for leaving your homeland.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing I found really interesting in this book is how the author portrayed how the same families, even sisters, even father, mother, cousins,
Yeah.
whatever it is, can be on different pages entirely. I mean, I think for many of us, we think that, okay, if one family member decides to go to Canada, they have their full support, and the family's on the same page because they're talking every day. But
Right.
you see so many examples in this book of family strife. I mean, what's best for the girls, I think, is one of the name of the chapters, which was harrowing to read, which is basically an email thread, and this is
Mm.
total spoilers, between one person,
Devastating.
saying, hey, send my daughters. I've worked hard for many years and I'm ready to have them in Canada now. And the sister basically saying, well, you didn't ask for them until now, and they've grown up here and they have a great life, so I'm not going to send them. And
Yeah.
it's just it's one of these heartbreaking chapters where you see it from both sides.
Because in that chapter, what I thought was really interesting was in the beginning, everyone was kind of on the same page, right? Or everyone
Hmm.
who could make
Everybody
the
knew the
decision.
plan,
Yeah,
right? So
exactly. The plan was straightforward. Yes, you go to Canada. Yes, you work. Yes, you send back money. And everyone's kind of providing for each other. And there was this whole concept of like, I owe you. And this is the way that I will pay back my debt to you, sister. And thank you for taking care of my children in the meantime. But then there was, yeah, like the entire focus of that chapter was just years later, now the mom is ready. Like she's provided the home, the environment is ready for the kids who have
the
been
legal
estranged from her.
paperwork.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
legal paperwork is done, and the kids are ready to be shipped off to Canada. And of course not. Like, how could that possibly be? Because the sister who's been taking care of her nieces, the twins, all this time is like, no way. No, you don't know what's best for your kid anymore. I've been taking care of them all this time. And it was so excruciating to read.
Absolutely. And the kicker
And
was they were going to where, none of it,
Yeah.
or
yeah, it
Northwest
wasn't just
Territories,
getting shipped to
Yellowknife.
Canada. It was in
It was,
Iqaluit, of all places,
yeah.
because she
That's
worked for the
right.
government.
Yeah.
And they have a funny exchange in those emails because it's basically an epistolary story in this chapter where they're talking back and forth, just saying, like, they don't want to live in Iqaluit. What are you going to do in Iqaluit? It's so cold. And then there's like an explanation, like, well, we always stay indoors and they're very well dressed and the outdoors is
Mm-hmm.
amazing. Okay, what about the crime? You want to talk about the crime? They're living in the Philippines right now.
In Manila,
There's
yeah.
nothing to do. There's nothing good to do in the Philippines either.
Yeah.
Like they have this like huge argument that goes on and on and on, and the way it finishes was brutal
Exactly.
because, spoiler alert,
Yeah.
the mother of the children initially didn't want to have the kids and wanted to have an abortion because they're twins. Um, and the mother, the sister that's raising those children, basically tells the kids that their mother wanted them aborted so that they
Mm-hmm.
would like hate her and
Hate her
not live
forever.
there forever.
Yeah.
That's a
Forever.
horrible thing to
Yeah.
do. I couldn't believe it, which brings me to wanted to mention about this specific chapter because this was my favorite chapter. It was hard to read because the way they choose to handle conflict is very immature.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
it feels extremely real and believable, but difficult to read in a way that made me feel like, God, I should be giving these people privacy. Like I shouldn't be reading this.
Did it feel foreign to you, Jacob? I'm curious because like I have an immigrant story. Aamer, you to an extent have an immigrant story, maybe not like first generational Canadian, but like I feel very close to the stories from this book because it feels personal. It feels relatable. I felt like I got to know my mom and dad through these stories. And I felt like, whoa, my brothers will never understand to the level that I do because I came here. I was born in Sri Lanka. So a lot of these stories felt, yeah, extremely painful, but super close to home. And I wondered if you had a very different experience reading this, especially because you said it feel like you needed to give these people their privacy.
See, I was going to ask you the exact reverse question
Yeah.
because you would definitely relate to this, but I don't. I really don't relate to these stories, but it's an interesting perspective for a reality that's a fact to a vast, huge chunk of
Mm-hmm.
Canadians, and I think it's important to understand these types of stories. There's a lot of aspects of like this familial responsibility to send money back to your home country to support your
Yeah.
people that's something that really surprised me, and I didn't
Yeah.
realize people worked that hard to spend that much money just to your family back home because that's just what you do. And there seems to be a disconnect between the people in Canada and the people in the Philippines, kind of misunderstanding the two different countries. Like the people in the Philippines thinking that Canada is like, then like I think they put it like they grow money on trees,
Right.
and then jobs are like incredibly well paying, and they're like loaded, and like the lifestyle is incredible. Whereas the people in Canada, especially the ones that grew up here, like the second generation immigrants, they think the Philippines is like a backwater fishing village, which
Yeah.
turns out to
Yeah.
not be the case. And it's
At
like, why am
all.
I sending you money if you're actually living very well in the Philippines? You're doing fine.
Yeah, and I think the chapter that illustrates that the best is the outsiders. I think that was a tough chapter for me to read as well, where the first person perspective is from a person that's living in Sarnhole. I think they describe the
Yeah.
city as
Sarnia, yeah.
Sarnia. Yeah.
What the locals call Sarnhole, and only the locals can do that.
Yeah.
And the sort of turnaround that entire chapter takes at the end, I mean, you were talking about sending money back, and this particular person who's giving us the narrative saw that happening from her parents, and basically them living, sort of above the poverty, barely above the poverty line, in a place where her parents literally sacrificed their lives to send money back home.
Mm-hmm.
And and then on top of all of that, these folks from the Philippines are coming to stay with her, and she's not happy about it at all. And you see how much anger she has for it. Her brother has left as well, leaving her alone in this place, which she clearly doesn't enjoy, but feels obligated to stay in. And from a spoiler perspective, the chapter ends with her seeing pictures of Manila from her niece, and I mean, I guess going back, and there's such heart wrenching scenes in that chapter, in terms of her begging her parents, like, I'll send you to the Philippines, you can see all the money and where it's gone and all that towards the end of their life, and they're like, no, this is our home, this is where we want to die. And it's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
I mentioned it earlier that one of the themes was sacrifice. And as a second generation immigrant, there seems to be a huge emphasis on recognizing the sacrifice that your parents did to move to this country and that you should obviously respect that. And I'm not sure how else to put it, but like honor your parents for the sacrifice and work that they've done to bring you to a new country. But it's a blessing and a curse, because like that chapter that you mentioned, Aamer, this woman feels like she's tied by an anchor to Sarnia, because that's the place that they decided to call home. And her brother's like, no, like, you can move, and she finds that disrespectful. And that's one of those aspects of the immigrant story that I would have never learned about if I hadn't read this book.
Actually, it's a huge thread throughout this book, where the pressure of the next generation is to owe back your parents for everything they did. And you see it in, the chapter where the teenage girl, I'm sorry, I don't remember the names of the chapters like you both do, but like the teenage girl's writing a letter to her mom being like, this is how you parent, right? A, B, C, or D, or all E, all of the above. Because it's a teenager and she's going through her like mental health crises, that her boyfriend is back home and she's got, dragged out of her home and her familiarities to come live with her mom in this new place. And she's just absolutely ungrateful, quote, because she's like, why would you bring me here? Mom, I want my iPad. And how dare you tell me to get off the phone? And her mom's just like, excuse me, look at all this. Look at what I'm providing for you. The fact that you even have an iPad to complain about. And really, like, that's what it is. I think a lot of children and teenagers, and as you grow up, this kind of relationship dynamic, it shows itself where the pressure of either doing really well academically, right? You see that with Monolith's mother, Dr. Monolith. It was what he's going to be one day because of everything that she's done for him to get there. And whether it's academically, whether it's just you owe your parents on this level or that level, whether it's, you will end up taking care of them no matter what it is that you need to go through. Basically, there's no individualism. Like in North America, we talk about individualism, we strive for it. But in these immigrant stories, you don't necessarily get there, right? Or you have to go through a lot of I don't know, weeding out or understanding of your situation to balance that individualism with the pressure that you get from the generations before you that have completely sacrificed their lives to get you here.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's the short version and the long version at the same time of Monolith's story, as you
Yes.
mentioned, about how hard the immigrant experience can be and how complicated it can be, frankly, right? So you have a child that can't speak in the terms of Monolith, and then you have all these sort of places he gets to and goes, right? From being with his auntie in the Philippines, to being with his mother, to coming across people who are familiar with people with autism in terms of the landlady, and then going to centers for Filipino people, and then ending up at Avril's brother, who is kind and able to sort of talk to him in lullabies and stories, but he doesn't speak Filipino. So you see all these disconnects where it's like, well, he's being bounced around everywhere, but nobody has all the pieces that can help him. Even though he's made it to Canada, even though he's made it to a Filipino community, even though he's made it to his mom.
And he's just a little boy.
And he's very, very young. And
yeah,
I don't know. I had a tear in my eye towards the end of the book because I thought it was a magnificent ending for the book. Because honestly, I couldn't see where the author would leave this book at the end. It's very difficult to see where that's going chapter by chapter. Sort of get lost in each story.
Especially because of the writing. I was curious about what you guys thought of the writing styles and how really it was quite disjointed in the ways that these characters are delivering their stories to us. But yet there's this overall, like, obviously these stories are all connected.
I'm pretty used to reading books that come from different points of views, and I've gotten to really enjoy that type of thing. I think what you're referencing here is that there's different like writing styles.
Yeah.
Like there's some that are like third person omniscient, and then others that are epistolary, like just literally reading emails back and forth. And then there's others where it's kind of written as a love letter.
Love letters, journals, diaries.
Yeah, journals, that type of thing, like a how-to guide on how to be a parent, or like how to be a caregiver in Canada. That was one of my favorite chapters too. It's right off the bat, but it's quite funny.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Rams, I'm surprised that you've been so positive so far.
Well,
because in the emails that you sent us leading up to this,
yeah, I know.
I forgot what you said exactly, but if I'm paraphrasing, you're like, honestly, it's not really my thing. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. So you have the floor. Like, what's going on here?
The reason why my initial reaction in the first half of the book, and Aamer, you kind of said it off the top, so I'm going to latch onto that. The first half of the book was very aggressive. I found that you were just starting to get to know the characters and their stories and their feelings, if you will. And a lot of feelings were just so angry. People were so angry. People were so, you said immature earlier. Yeah.
Bitter.
Yeah, bitter. And like, I understand the hardships, and later on you kind of got to see the heart of things and the heart of other people, which then like balanced it out. But in the beginning it was just like she's angry and she's angry and she's angry at her, and especially because there's so many women being depicted and profiled in this book. Obviously the women are the caregivers, the women are the PSWs, the women are the mothers, the sisters, the daughters, and a lot of the women were just so resentful, bitter, and angry, and I found that to be indigestible up until a certain point. I was just like, okay, can we get somewhere productive, please? But again, that comes from just like my experience of conflict or working through things and whatever, and it felt like they were on such a basic level of understanding and not necessarily empathetic to other people's emotions. But again, all that is unraveled through the book, right?
Yeah, and I think that's part of it in terms of, the anger comes first, the explanation comes later.
Exactly.
Especially with, you see how much punishment these women have basically taken in before they get to where they are.
1000%.
And then, and I wanted to mention the other reason why I find the Lolo Bayani chapter one of my favorites, because it explains the traditional Filipino song of Kandiman. I hope I'm saying that right. And one of the things I'd like to ask the author is if the book was also sort of structured in that style, because the way the Kandiman song is described is it's a love song, but it starts with a lot of strife and a lot of complex things, and then
Oh,
sort of evens out towards the end towards some sort of
Finishes
resolution.
well.
And I feel like this book is very
interesting.
very similar to that path. So
What a poet, Amer.
I I would not be surprised, because it does feel like this book was very deliberately assembled,
Yes.
especially in the way that little Monolith gets sent back and forth in a way it's like tied from story to story. I think he makes an appearance in every single chapter in one way or another,
Yeah.
even if it's like some sort of
If
like
it's just a name drop.
off-headed comment. Yeah, it's just
Yeah.
a name
yeah.
drop here and there. Um, so what about you, Amr? Did you have any negatives about this book? You seem to be
Yeah, I mean,
kind of raving about it.
there's a lot of chapters which are not easy to read.
No.
I think it's phenomenally well written. I don't think it's everybody's cup of tea. I mean, there's some books which have a very wide general appeal. I don't think this is going to be one of them. This is the difficult piece to read about a lot of people and their struggles and strife and those pieces. I'm glad I read it, and I would definitely recommend it to people who can handle the subject matter. But it's not something like, a beach summer read or something. It's definitely
Mm-mm.
not in that category at all. Somewhere in the same category as Holmes, but a different book entirely. I mean, I think
Oh
this is a
my
lot more
goodness. I
like
would have
written
never
in a
drawn those
completely different way.
parallels.
Well, I mean, it's about an immigrant experience, right? And it's a short book. I
And
mean, that's
that's
pretty
where
much
it ends.
that's where it ends.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's pretty much where I'd agree with you on that.
How much time do we
Um,
have? Do we have a couple minutes?
Yeah, you can go. You sound like you have something to say. You can take a
I
couple
just want to
minutes.
ask you guys about, because nobody's touched on this yet. The book, or the chapter with the very loving, fairy tale husband who's so excited to meet back with his
Oh,
wife, to then only
yes.
realize that his wife
the
hates him.
resume of whatever
Oh,
his name was.
yes.
Yeah, and that was an interesting stylistic choice too, because it all sort of centers around his resume and all the things he's trying to
Trying to
do.
find work. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think that goes to what Jacob was saying earlier about how tough and complicated and maybe not what you're expecting Canada is, where this guy's just trying to find a decent job after working on a cruise ship for whatever 9 years,
Yes.
and
Being
the various
separated
jobs
from his wife and his kids.
and
Yeah,
and the sort of hyperbole of all the jobs he gets, right? Oh, you're in sales? Okay, we'll put you in a sales position, and he ends up selling vegetables on the side of the
it's like
road. It's
selling
just like it's
jam on the
heartbreaking.
side of the highway. That chapter had such a good twist that I didn't see coming whatsoever.
Yeah.
Where basically he seems like the fairy tale husband. He hasn't seen his beautiful wife in 9 years, and they have these kids that he's never seen in 9 years, and he's been traveling the world on a cruise ship, working hard, accumulating money, and then they finally find each other again. But the woman does not love him whatsoever.
Mm.
And not only does she not love him, she has really good reasons not to, because this guy is like obsessed with her, and she never loved him at all. And I think
Not
the way
even
she
at the
puts it
beginning.
is that you don't love us, you don't love me, you don't love the kids, you never say our names, we're just characters in your life. And when you look back at the entire setup of that chapter, you realize it's so true.
Yeah.
He's just like a self-obsessed person where
He's
being in love is like
self-obsessed.
part of his character.
And she's self-sacrificing. Like, she's just been trying to work and get to her kids and provide
Yes.
for her kids. And it's so interesting because at the beginning of the chapter, she's just so rude and
I hated her. I
yeah,
hated
she
her
was so
so much.
aggressive, and she wouldn't let him touch her, and she's just like, no, no, no. And I was just like, what's going on with her? Like, why? And she seemed to be so stressed and anxious about so much, but then by the end of it, it was just like an absolute slap in the face for all of us.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of the opposite of the young lovers sort of story, right?
That's
I
right,
mean,
yeah.
oh, this was very endearing, this was very cute, we got married inside our friend's place or whatever, and she's like, what? This was the worst thing ever.
I know. I didn't even
Yeah.
want to be next to you. What are you doing here? Right.
Yeah, the only reason she got married to him in the first place was because she felt like she didn't have much of a choice, and that she was immature, and like because this guy asked her to marry, like she was just too young and dumb. I think she was like 17 at the time. So
Yeah.
like, she felt like she was just stuck there for her entire life. So you really feel for her. There's a huge like flip of the script, and that was one of my favorite chapters. But Amer, before we wrap up, do you have any final thoughts? Anything people should know about this book?
I do. I think the other reason why I like this book is it's a lot of the pieces do have a string and a seed of hope in them, especially towards the end of the chapters.
Yeah.
The author also sort of touches on LGBTQ and trans as well in the book, and those chapters could have gone very differently than they did. And I think that's a hopeful piece. I mean, as always, I really enjoy the smaller sort of endearments and pieces that authors put into books. I mean, Monolith's first person narrative, I thought was excellent. Even though he can't talk, we get to hear his thoughts. And, just his description of something like the click, click lock. And, it just, yeah, I don't know. I really enjoyed those little touches in the book.
Ramya, final thoughts?
I just want to say that there are a lot of complicated, multifaceted issues. It is not meant to be, a complete deep dive that you'll understand, like, oh, now I understand the immigrant experience at the end of the day. But there are very, very important aspects here, whether you take it out of, women's roles or men's roles or self-sacrifice, or what it really means to leave a country and settle somewhere else. There's everything has something to it, and it's a deep book, so you'll take away something.
And I think this goes back to what Aamer was saying earlier, and that it's probably best to read this chapter by chapter, take it slowly, because it's not just dense in themes and a scenario, it's also fairly dense to read. It was not exactly an easy listen, but it was definitely engaging, and so was this conversation. Guys, thank you so much. This is great.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
That was Aamer Khan, our AMI audiobook review curator, and Ramya Amuthan of AMI. We were reviewing Reuniting with Strangers by Jennilee Austria-Bonifacio. You can find that in human narrated audio on Sela if you want to listen to it. That's all the time we have for AMI audiobook review. AMI Today airs live at 11 a.m. Eastern every weekday on AMI Audio, and it repeats every 8 hours. So that's live at 11 a.m. Eastern, and it repeats at 7 p.m. or 3 a.m. in case you're interested. You can also find the show wherever you listen to podcasts, including YouTube. Just look up AMI Today or AMI Audiobook Review. I'm Jacob Szymanski. Have a good one.